Thanks, Lee. So we've spoken about the site, and now we need to talk about how we manage our grapes on that, or our vines on that site. Really, our aims are to achieve, those fruit quality parameters that we discussed earlier in an efficient and hopefully sustainable way. I like to start my vineyard year at pruning, as everyone should. I haven't talked about vineyard establishment. That's probably a separate discussion, but it's not, particularly unique to sparkling. So why we're pruning, we're trying to control our yield, our vine vigour, pest and disease management, and hence grape quality. Over my time managing some large areas of sparkling wine grapes, I think arch cane pruning has really shown itself to be probably the most effective and sustainable way. It gives us a more reliable yield year to year. It helps to space out the fruit. We don't end up with all our fruit concentrated in one area. It kind of spreads it through the canopy a little bit more. We'd see more even growth, particularly early in the season. Takes out a little bit of that apical dominant effect, and that leads to a bit less variability later on. Arch cane can be pretty simple to teach pruners who haven't done a lot of pruning. It's quicker than flat cane as well. And arch cane can actually be reasonably cost effective when it's done with a machine like the climber to remove the bulk of that fruit. So we would see on the same site, same variety, same clone, arch cane was about 30% dearer than spur to prune. So not out of the realms of affordability. Now spur is obviously going to be cheaper. You probably, in the long term, you might be compromising yield just with there's a lot more variation. So the two things that are impacting our yield are the in-season influences, like the weather at flowering, and then we have the bud initiation that's happening in the summer before. So with cane pruning, you've just got more buds in the sun, you should have more fruit. We might see a higher disease risk with spur as well because we're just simply bunching all that fruit close to the cordon. We're not getting that airflow. I have seen it work fairly well on some cool climate sparkling sites, but that was when we were doing things like shoot thinning and using some of the soft pruning principles that I'll talk about as well. And then shoot thinning, I've really come to see this as part of pruning and even budgeting for it in that way. So when we're shoot thinning, we're selecting our shoots for next year and we're directing all of that growth into the producing shoots that we want to retain. If we're on a high vigour site and we've pruned things pretty heavily, you're going to get a lot of water shoots. It's just what happens. And if you can go through and take those out in spring, it's a hell of a lot quicker than doing it at pruning, but you're retaining that growth to go into the shoots that you want. It can be pretty quick, particularly with arch cane, and it also helps with our disease management. And this image is basically a vine that wasn't shoot thinned very well, and you can see all the big cuts that we've had to make on the top of that crown. Now, probably none of those canes had bunches on them, so they were unproductive shoots anyway. We've had to make big cuts near the crown and potentially introducing trunk disease. So shoot thinning definitely is part of pruning. And then trunk disease we've spoken about a little bit today. Obviously, you're in a cool, wet climate, you have a much higher risk. Now, the guidance is, okay, don't go and prune in the rain, and that gets really, really hard when you've basically got to get all your pruning done with a limited amount of staff and you only get so many sunny days. And there's good fungicide options out there for trunk disease, painting wounds. That also gets difficult when you're trying to do it around the weather. So the soft pruning techniques like the Simonon search and the Poussard methods, in a very simplistic way, we're trying to maintain the sap flow in the vine. We're not making big cuts, and where we are making cuts, we're leaving some wood to die back for next season. And that just means if any trunk disease or anything's floating around in the environment, it's going into that wood, it's not going to make it into the main flow of the vine. Now, this particular vine here was probably a 20-odd-year-old Chardonnay vine that we were pulling out anyway. But you can see with all those big cuts that have been made over the year on the top of that crown, this is the amount of dieback that we've got going down that trunk. But what is important to see also is how the sap flow's been maintained on the outside of the trunk. So when we're using those soft pruning principles, we're really trying to maintain that sap flow into the spurs or the canes that we're trying to retain. It's a really, really important way to prune, or have in your mind, particularly in a cool climate. So now canopy management, we spoke about this just quickly before, but really for me, VSP, it's cheaper to manage, it's pretty cost effective. We're probably using narrow rows, so we need to get things upright because we need to retain those canes for next season. We can't have things hanging out. It helps maintain our fruit coverage as well from sunburn and things like that. And it really is well designed for shoot thinning because everything's just going up. We're keeping things nice and straight. And some of our clonal selections help to play into how easy things are to canopy manage. Shoot thinning I've spoken about. So obviously it's a lot quicker to go through and just bust off all those little green shoots. You're pretty much walking through the vineyard rather than cutting them off at pruning next year. And it's a really good way to manage your disease and promote airflow through the canopy. Now canopy height, we want plenty of leaves, so that gives us our factory to ripen that fruit, and it also provides some protection. So, at least in our part of the world, in the east of Australia, the really worst part of the day to be out and get sunburnt is after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because that sun's getting a bit low. And if you've got a nice high canopy, you're basically only sacrificing one row of the vineyard. The rest of the stuff is being protected in the shade from the row next to it. But obviously your trellis needs to be set up to maintain a nice high canopy. And then trimming and leaf removal. So the timing of trimming is really, really important. I think it sort of gets thought about like, they look a bit untidy, just go out and trim. But what we're trying to do with trimming is actually slow down some of that vegetative growth and get the vine to focus on the fruit. If we can time it right, maybe we're looking at our soil moisture monitoring and we're seeing the vines are starting to use that moisture. Maybe we've got some cooler weather coming, so the growth might slow down as well. Try and time it then. And otherwise, if you go too early, and if you trim too low, you just end up with water shoots and laterals and things like that, and you're constantly trimming, trying to get on top of it. So trimming is a really important part of management. And again, nice and high, and don't go too hard on the sides because we want to maintain that coverage for that fruit. Now, leaf removal, when I was in Tasmania, we did lots and lots of leaf removal on table wine blocks, and even on the sparkling blocks, just trying to get some leaves off on the southern or the eastern side, the cool side of the canopy, can really help in a high disease pressure season or in a high disease risk site, just to get a bit of airflow in there without compromising that exposure. And doing that mechanically is pretty cost effective. Now, pest and disease management, obviously we've picked, higher vigor sites in cooler, wetter areas, so we've got a higher risk, so you need to be prepared for higher inputs. And also, but we are harvesting earlier, so something like botrytis, even in a really bad season, doesn't really get going in sparkling, simply because we don't have the sugar in the berries. So that's a little bit of a saving there. It really needs to be integrated. We've talked about clonal selection, site selection, starting at pruning, everything we're doing before we get the sprayer out to try and open up that canopy and maintain airflow and reduce our disease risk is really, really important. And also managing the vineyard floor. So I'll talk about that a bit more later, but that's, it's a really critical part of, maintaining that airflow and stopping that splashing, particularly down to mildew, into the canopy. So effective spraying techniques. So having a really good idea of your weather monitoring, looking at the plants, using those things to make your decisions rather than just, it's Monday, go and start spraying. I think, anyone who's going through Sustainable Wine Growing Australia or anything like that, and I'd encourage everyone to do that, you need to be showing reasons as to why you're doing things. And pesticide spraying is one of those things. We need to have really good data on why we're spraying, when we're spraying, and things like that. So using the information, the data sources out there to inform your decisions is really, really important, particularly in a cool climate when we've got limited spray windows, a lot of rainfall, we've got higher pesticide use anyway. Again, using good data to inform those decisions. Now, any sprayer can be set up to do a good job, I believe, but for about the last 13 years, I've been using recycling canopy sprayers in vineyards, and I'm a really big fan of them for cool climate VSP canopies. They are really, really well suited. We're using less water, we're using less chemical, but early in the season when our spray windows can be reduced, there's rain coming, we've just had rain, the vines are growing like anything. The biggest killer to efficiency when you're spraying is filling up the tank. It doesn't matter if you're spraying 2 or 3 rows, driving 10 kilometres an hour, none of those things matter as much as filling up the tank. If you're doing 1 fill a day instead of 5 or 6, it brings that whole spraying window into a couple of days rather than a week. And that can be really, really important, particularly early in the season when it's critical to get your disease control right. So if you want to talk about that a bit more later, I'm happy for anyone to come up and chat about that. Now, the vineyard floor, this is something, in the last few years that's getting a lot more attention, which I think is really good. Again, we've chosen higher vigour sites, we've chosen higher rainfall. So the vines are growing like anything, which means the stuff on the ground is also going to grow like anything, and we need to manage that. So their mid-row and under-vine management becomes very important. There is, lots of different techniques out there available, depending on what you're trying to achieve at your site. I think one thing I've seen in my career is a really positive move away from having that bare soil, bloody scorched earth policy underneath vines. We know how important it is for soil health to keep that soil covered, preferably with growing plants, but at least keeping it covered. Whether you're using herbicides or not, it doesn't really matter. Ideally, we've got some native indigenous grass or ground cover species growing under there, which are going to require a lot less management. But how we get those established is a challenge, and finding the right species mix for your particular site is, again, a bit of a challenge, but I think the advantages are there. And also, it's really important to just keep in mind when you're bringing in external sources like compost, mulch, things like that, know the source of it. There's been some real horror stories in agriculture of people bringing in compost to their site and they didn't know the provenance of it, and irreversibly damaging the soil. So whatever we can do on our site is really, really an advantage compared to bringing things in. So irrigation and nutrition, So I talked a little bit about knowing how much water you think you might need at your site and having that as a basis for how you're going to irrigate. But in a cool climate and a high rainfall area, it's really, really important to know your root zone depth, because we need those vines maximising that stored water before we think about irrigating in the season. And the only way you can do that is to dig some holes and see where your roots are and understand how that soil profile holds moisture. So it's really, really important. Because, vines with shallow roots, vines on their own roots, they're going to dry out a lot more quickly and they'll need supplementation with irrigation. So in a high rainfall region, those vines are used to getting moisture from the whole vineyard floor. And you can see it in this image. This is probably a 30-year-old Chardonnay vine, and I'm not sure how well that vineyard was established. It's on its own roots. I know for a fact the ripping was a bit hit and miss in terms of whether it was actually in the vine row or not. But you can see how these roots have just gone down and spread. They haven't busted down into that clay. They're not using any of that stored moisture. So even though we're on a 800 or 900 millimetre annual rainfall site and we've had a wet spring, these vines still need irrigation, before Christmas. And the only way you know that is to dig some holes. Water's another thing. We need to be more judicious in how we use it, and having good data, good monitoring to inform those decisions. There is myriad systems out there to measure your soil moisture. There's satellites, AI, all sorts of stuff out there available to know when you need to irrigate and how much you should put on, rather than just, it hasn't rained for a while, let's stick some water on. We spoke a little bit about the post-harvest impact with sparkling, so it's a real advantage. The grapes are off, we've got some good time there to keep that canopy functioning. That's the time to look at some of your macronutrients. But again, we can only do that if we're doing soil testing, PDL testing, understanding what the vine's using, what reserves it has. But yeah, keeping those vines functioning as long as possible into autumn is really, really important, because if we get a cool, wet spring, those vines can't access, doesn't matter how good the soil is, if if it's cool and it's wet, they're going away on their own carbohydrate reserves, so they need to store that in the previous autumn. Now harvesting, I'll just go through it quickly, but I've picked thousands and thousands of tonnes of vintage sparkling with machines, and you know, it's timely, it's efficient, it maintains grape quality, but it's completely to do with how well that machine is set up and operated. So this can be a bit of a trap when we're using contractors, because you know, it's fine, they won't have the knowledge of the site that your own operators do, even though they use their machines all the time and they know them really well. Yeah, just that setup is really, really important with machines, but they do allow us to pick the grapes exactly when they need to be picked. And hand harvesting is really driven by the access to skilled labour. You know, we used to be able to just get 30 or 40 backpackers to go out and pick 20 tonnes before lunch, but it's been a long time since that's happened. And the cost of that now, it's really important to have skilled labour for hand harvesting. And something we did a lot of in Tasmania, because we were leaf plucking anyway, we wouldn't leaf pluck, you know, at least one side of those sparkling blocks, but we would always go out and leaf pluck the other side the day before we were hand harvesting. It is, I can't remember the numbers, but sometimes it was half the cost. It's just by simply getting all those leaves off before the crew went through. And then finally, staff. So I spoke about this a little bit before, but having access and good staff on your sites is absolutely critical to growing any grapes. You know, in cool climates and with sparkling, we're asking a lot of staff. You know, they've got to work around weather, they've got to work weekends, early days, long days, this sort of thing. So we need to really allow them some flexibility as well. Keeping your staff motivated. Doesn't matter if you've got one staff member or 100. If you can give them some ownership of their job and some space to make their own decisions, that really helps with their motivation, as well as having, you know, the resources and training to do their jobs properly. There's nothing more frustrating for an operator than, you know, we're all set to go out and spray for the day and they go into the shed and half the chemicals are not there, as a very, you know, easy example to see. And that's something when you're a manager or an owner, you think, oh, well, I'll just go and get that and, you know, it'll be fine. But that's impacted that person's work day. And yeah, having their resources to do their jobs really keeps them motivated. Paying staff is a bit of a contentious issue. So even if we can't pay them more, a lot of the time we can make their workplace really good. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a vineyard operator, if you've got to choose to work for someone who's got a 20-year-old tractor that has to have the spanners put on it 3 times a day compared to someone who's got a 2-year-old tractor who keeps it well maintained and looked after, where are the better staff? Where are the better operators going to go? They're going to go here. So, you know, make their workplace great, even if you can't afford to pay them more. Keeping them engaged is really, really important, particularly, you know, those long weeks when they're constantly spraying, things like that. Make sure they're involved in those decisions. So even if you're a small operator, family business, people who work for you, they care about what's happening in the business. Sometimes, you know, working for big companies, they put out sales things like, oh, their sales are doing and this, and sometimes as a manager I would think, oh, do my staff really want to know? But you put those things up and they are interested. They want to know, you know, how the sales are going and how our wines are doing and things like that. So involving them in those decisions that impact them really helps to keep them engaged. And then above all, keeping them safe and looking after their well-being will keep them around and working productively for you and keep them happier. I know health and safety gets a bit of a bad rap, but we do it particularly badly in agriculture. It's still the riskiest industry to work in, I think, so we can all be doing better. And if you've ever had to deal with a workplace incident and a staff member who's off for a lot of time, particularly at critical times of the year, you'll realise how important it is to have those safety systems in place and to be looking after your staff. So I think that's about it. If you've got any questions, you're happy to catch up during the breaks during the day and talk about anything specifically, that'd be great. But thanks for your time.